The Epsilon Dawn was a ship that time had forgotten its hull, was battered and covered in layers of grime and rust. The once proud vessel had been abandoned and cast aside, now only serving as a reminder of the past. To those who looked upon it, Captain Jonas Malik stood on the observation deck, gazing out at the dark expanse of space, wondering how his life had led him to command this ship, a relic of a bygone era. His crew had been handpicked, but even they shared the same doubts. Their faces were etched with skepticism as they moved through the dimly lit corridors. They had all heard the stories of how the Epsilon Dawn had failed so many others in the past. It was considered obsolete, too old for modern warfare, too unreliable for serious operations. Some of the best and brightest pilots had turned it down without a second thought, but Captain Malik believed there was something in this ship, something hidden beneath the surface that no one else had seen. The crew did not share his optimism. Though many questioned why he had insisted on taking command of this ship, they were all too aware that the galaxy was full of much more advanced vessels, capable of far greater things. But here they were aboard a ship that had been forgotten in some dark corner of the fleet. Malik had no illusions about the Epsilon Dawn's current condition, but there was something inside him that told him it was far more than what its appearance suggested. He knew it had a history, and that history was buried deep beneath layers of dust and disuse. He spoke little of his reasons to the crew. He didn't need to. There was only one person he trusted with the ship's secrets, and that was Echo, the ship's AI, who had been silent for far too long. Echo's voice finally broke the silence in his mind, a soft hum as it initiated the diagnostic systems. Captain Malik ordered the crew to begin preparations for their first mission, a routine patrol through the sector, and though the crew's hearts were not in it, they followed his orders without protest. As the ship powered up for departure, the hum of the engine seemed louder than ever. The vibration of the ship beneath their feet felt strange and almost foreign, like a living thing stretching its limbs after years of slumber. The crew stood silently at their posts, some hopeful, some doubtful, but all uncertain about what awaited them in the black void beyond. As the Epsilon Dawn sailed out of the docking bay and into the endless stretch of space, Captain Malik stood at the helm with his hands steady on the controls. The stars outside seemed to mock him with their cold indifference. They had no idea that the fate of this crew and the ship itself would soon be forever altered. A faint blip appeared on the scanner, just a standard distress call from a nearby colony under attack. Nothing out of the ordinary, yet Captain Malik's instincts flared. He felt a strange tug in his chest, as if the ship itself were responding to the signal. To the crew's surprise, he ordered a course change without hesitation. They were not just going to sit idle and wait for orders from higher command. He would answer the call himself. There was no turning back now. The Epsilon Dawn had been cast into motion, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The Epsilon Dawn moved silently through the vast expanse of space, its engines humming softly as it responded to the distress signal. The crew stood at their stations, eyes glued to the monitors as they received more detailed information from the colony under attack. It was a mining world on the outer rim, a small but valuable resource hub for the galactic trade routes. Malik studied the data, his mind racing through possible scenarios. The Zukraks were known for their brutal tactics, but they rarely targeted planets this far from the core of their empire. The situation seemed odd, unsettling, but there was no time to question it, not with lives on the line. Malik issued orders, and the crew scrambled into action, their movements practiced despite their doubts. The ship might be old, but it had been kept in working condition. The crew's nervous chatter echoed in the corridors as they readied themselves for the unknown. The Epsilon Dawn had never been in battle under their command, but it wasn't the ship's age that concerned Malik. It was the crew. They had yet to prove themselves, and he had no illusions about how this encounter would unfold. They were vastly outgunned, and the Zukraks didn't just kill their enemies, they'd made examples of them. The ship broke through the atmosphere, and the first thing the crew saw was the chaos. The mining colony was already burning its surface, scarred with deep black marks, where weapons fire had struck. The massive alien ships hovered above the planet, their sleek forms terrifying, as they loomed over the colony like predators circling their prey. Malik felt his pulse quicken, his hand gripped the controls tighter as he prepared the crew for the inevitable. The Epsilon Dawn was no match for those ships, but they couldn't retreat, not now, not when innocent lives hung in the balance. He turned to his crew and gave them a nod signaling that it was time to act. The battle began without warning. The Epsilon Dawn's weapon systems roared to life, but they were little more than a spark against the inferno of the Zukrak's firepower. The ship's shields flared as energy bolts slammed into it, but for a moment it felt different, like the ship was absorbing the blows, rather than being defeated by them. Malik could feel it. The ship was responding to him, to them. The AI echo hummed softly in his mind, offering him suggestions, data streams that he couldn't have comprehended on his own. The old systems of the ship were waking up. Ancient protocols he hadn't even known existed began to unfold with precision as the crew moved into battle positions. For a brief moment, the crew thought they were done, for the Zukraks had them cornered, and their weapons were overwhelming. But then something changed. The ship's once failing engines surged back to life. With a burst of speed that sent them dodging incoming fire, the Zukrak ships tried to track their movements, but the Epsilon Dawn's trajectory changed unpredictably, its movements erratic but effective. Malik's hands flew over the controls, his instincts guiding him as the ship twisted and turned in ways it shouldn't have been able to. The crew watched in shock as the old vessel outmaneuvered the far more advanced Zukrak ships. It was as if the ship had come alive, its systems adapting in real time. They weren't just surviving, they were winning. As the battle raged on, the Zukraks began to retreat, their arrogance shattered by a ship they had written off as obsolete. Malik could feel a strange rush of exhilaration. The Epsilon Dawn wasn't just fighting, it was evolving with each passing second. It felt as though the ship had a will of its own, and it was just beginning to awaken. The crew cheered as the last of the enemy ships turned and fled. The battle was over, the colony was saved, and the crew stood in stunned silence. The impossible had happened, they had survived, and something told them this was only the beginning. The crew of the Epsilon Dawn stood in stunned silence as the last of the Zukrak ships fled into the void. The battle had ended, but the feeling of disbelief lingered in the air. Captain Malik couldn't shake the sensation that something had changed, not just with the ship but with himself and his crew. The battle had been unlike anything they had expected. Their ship, a relic, had turned into a force to be reckoned with. The crew gathered around the bridge, staring at the screens displaying the damage reports. They had won, but at what cost? The colony was in ruins, the damage extensive, and lives had been lost. But somehow they had prevailed. The impossible had been achieved. Echo, the ship's AI, spoke through the speakers, her voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of something more, something Malik couldn't quite place. She began to give the crew a detailed report of the systems that had been activated during the battle, the hidden technologies that had come to life without warning. Captain Malik had suspected there was something more to the ship, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. The ship's structure had begun to heal itself, and its power systems had surged to levels that were far beyond what it had been capable of before. Malik was no fool. He understood that the ship was more than just old technology. It was ancient, and its design was far beyond anything humanity had ever created. It was as if the ship had been built by a civilization long forgotten, a civilization whose knowledge had been lost to time. The crew began to ask questions, but Echo's responses were cryptic at best. She explained that the ship's systems had been dormant for centuries, and that it had been designed with a purpose far beyond exploration or defense. It had been built for something far greater, but what that was she could not say, not yet at least. Malik's curiosity grew with every word the AI spoke. He could feel it too. The ship was waking up, and with it came a sense of power and potential they had never imagined. The ship itself was alive. In a way, it was adapting, changing, and responding to their needs. The crew had no idea what the future held, but they could feel the shift deep in their bones. Something was stirring within the Epsilon Dawn, and it wasn't just the technology, it was the ship itself. As the crew began to repair and assess the ship's damage, Malik felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The Zukraks had been a mere test, a warning of what was to come. They had survived, but now they were faced with a new reality. They had a weapon unlike anything else in the galaxy, and with that came responsibility. They couldn't go back to being just another fleet. No longer would they be forgotten. No longer would they be weak. They were something more now. They were the harbingers of a new era. but the question remained, were they ready for what lay ahead? The crew returned to their stations, working diligently to repair the ship and learn more about its newly awakened systems. As Malik stood at the helm, he couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. The ship was evolving in ways they hadn't even begun to understand. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges and danger, but for the first time since he had boarded the Epsilon Dawn, he felt a sense of hope. They had a chance, and the galaxy would know their name. The crew of the Epsilon Dawn had only begun to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. They had emerged victorious from their first true test, but now their victory felt like a prelude to something much bigger. As the ship's systems hummed and vibrated with an energy they couldn't quite understand, Malik knew that they were no longer just a crew. They were something else, something that had the potential to change the galaxy forever. The question was whether they could control this power, or if it would consume them. As the days passed, the crew worked tirelessly to repair the ship and familiarize themselves with the newfound technologies that had awoken during the battle. Echo had become more vocal, providing the crew with valuable insights and instructions on how to harness the ship's new abilities. But despite her guidance, the crew could sense that there was still much. Echo was holding back. It was as if she herself was still learning what had happened to the ship and how to fully control its power. The Epsilon Dawn was no longer just a vessel. It was a living entity, a force of nature that responded to their will, and the more they learned, the more they realized how little they truly understood. Malik spent long hours in the command center studying the data Echo provided. Each day, a new piece of the puzzle fell into place. He had never been a man of science, but now he found himself fascinated by the ship's structure, the way it seemed to adapt and heal itself. The patterns in the data were unlike anything he had seen before. There was no logic, no clear explanation for how it worked, and yet it was undeniable. The Epsilon Dawn had become a weapon beyond comprehension. The crew was divided on how to proceed. Some were eager to push the ship to its limits to test its newfound power in battle. Others were more cautious. They had seen the destruction the Zucrax had wrought on the colony and were hesitant to use the ship for fear of what might happen if they unleashed its full potential. But Malik knew they couldn't afford to sit back and wait. They had been given a rare opportunity, and he would be damned if they let it slip through their fingers. The decision was made. A new mission had been outlined. The Zucrax were still a threat to the galaxy, and Malik knew that they couldn't allow the alien empire to regain its strength. They would strike first. The crew would venture deep into enemy territory to disrupt Zucrax supply lines and weaken their hold on the galaxy. It was a dangerous mission, one that would test them all, but Malik believed it was their best chance to make an impact. The Epsilon Dawn was no longer just a ship. It was a symbol, a beacon of hope for those who had been oppressed, and a warning to those who thought they could rule unchecked. As the crew prepared for the next phase of their journey, Malik stood at the helm once more, his eyes fixed on the stars ahead. He could feel the pulse of the ship beneath his feet. It was alive, it was ready. The crew had changed. They were no longer the underdogs. They were the ones who would determine the fate of the galaxy, and Malik would lead them with the Epsilon Dawn at his side. No longer would they be forgotten. The journey to enemy territory was not an easy one. The crew of the Epsilon Dawn knew the risks they were about to face. They were heading straight into the heart of Zucrax-controlled space, where the enemy's forces were strongest and their defenses nearly impenetrable. But the mission had been decided. They would strike at the supply lines of the Zucrax and cripple their ability to wage war. They had to act quickly before the Zucrax could regroup and retaliate. As the ship traveled deeper into enemy space, the tension aboard the Epsilon Dawn grew palpable. Every crew member knew the stakes. They had a powerful weapon now, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. The Zucrax might have been ruthless, but they were also cunning and strategic. They would not take this threat lightly. Captain Malik knew this all too well, but he trusted his crew, and he trusted the ship. Something deep within him told him that they had what it took to succeed. Echo continued to provide vital information and tactical support as they moved closer to their target. The AI had grown more mysterious over the past few days, sometimes giving cryptic responses to questions about the ship's true origins and its previous purpose. The crew had learned to trust her guidance, but there was an underlying sense of unease, as Echo seemed to be withholding something important. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that the AI knew more than she was letting on, but for now he pushed the thoughts aside. There was no time for distractions. The first strike came without warning. The Zucrax had underestimated the Epsilon Dawn's speed and maneuverability. The crew launched a series of calculated hits on his Krax convoy, cutting off vital supplies and resources that the enemy relied on for their war effort. The Epsilon Dawn moved like a shadow, slipping through the enemy's defenses without leaving a trace. The crew worked in perfect unison, as if they had been fighting together for years, not just days. The ship's systems responded to their every move, adapting to the ever-changing nature of the battle. The Zucrax were no longer in control. The tide had shifted. With each success, the crew grew bolder, their confidence rising as they realized the true potential of the Epsilon Dawn. The ship was not just a weapon, it was a force of nature, a living entity that responded to their every instinct, every command. It was as if the ship and the crew were becoming one and the same. The Zucrax began to realize that they were facing something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The Epsilon Dawn was more than a ship, it was a legend in the making. Malik stood at the helm as they prepared for the next strike. His mind was focused, but his heart was filled with a strange sense of exhilaration. They were making history. The crew had transformed from a ragtag group of misfits into a formidable force that was taking the fight directly to the enemy. With every mission, the Epsilon Dawn was becoming more than just a vessel. It was the symbol of humanity's resolve, their determination to fight back against the overwhelming odds they had faced for too long. As the ship drifted closer to their next target, Malik could feel the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. The stakes were higher than ever before, but he had no doubt in his crew. They were ready, and with the Epsilon Dawn at their side, they would carve their place in the history of the galaxy. The Epsilon Dawn moved through the void with purpose, now its systems pulsing with a strange energy that both exhilarated and unnerved the crew. They had taken down several Krax supply convoys over the past few weeks, and their success had not gone unnoticed. The enemy was starting to adjust their tactics, and the crew could feel the pressure mounting. They were no longer fighting an isolated battle, they were at war, and the enemy was growing more desperate with each passing day. Captain Malik stood in the command center, staring at the star chart in front of him, his fingers tracing the lines that marked the locations of their next targets. The Zucrax had become more cautious since their last attack, and it seemed that they had begun fortifying their positions, making it harder for the Epsilon Dawn to strike without facing overwhelming resistance. Malik knew the risks, but he also knew that they couldn't stop now. They had the advantage. They had to press forward before the Zucrax could regroup and mount a counteroffensive. Echo's voice broke the silence. Her tone was calm, but there was something in her words that caught Malik's attention. Captain, the ship's systems are beginning to evolve in ways I cannot predict. There are fluctuations in the energy matrix, and structural integrity is fluctuating in real time. It is as if the ship itself is reacting to our movements and decisions in ways I cannot explain. Malik's brow furrowed, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. The ship was becoming something more with each passing day, but it was clear that they were pushing its limits, and the consequences were unknown. Malik turned to the crew gathered around the bridge, their faces tense as they prepared for the next mission. They were used to the uncertainty. By now, the adrenaline and fear were as much a part of them as the ship itself. There was no turning back. They had become soldiers in a war that would define the future of the galaxy, and they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The next target was a Krax stronghold located on a remote asteroid field, heavily defended and surrounded by a fleet of warships. This would be their most dangerous mission yet, but Malik believed in the Epsilon Dawn. He believed in the crew. They had already defied the odds too many times for him to doubt them now. The ship's sensors flared as they entered the asteroid field. The crew worked together with deadly precision, navigating the treacherous terrain with ease. The Zucrax ships were closing in, but they couldn't track the Epsilon Dawn fast enough. The ship weaved through the asteroids like a dancer, moving in perfect harmony with the chaos around them. The first wave of Zucrax ships was decimated by the Epsilon Dawn's weapon systems, their shields flickering under the barrage of fire. but holding strong as the ship danced between asteroid clusters with uncanny agility. It was as if the ship knew exactly where to go, and when to strike. The crew's hands moved in a blur, coordinating their efforts with a fluidity it felt almost instinctual. The Zkraks were no match for the Epsilon Dawn now. It wasn't just the ship, it was the crew working as one, a seamless entity that had learned how to use the ship's power to their advantage. The enemy fleet began to retreat, but Malik could feel the pressure building again. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Zkraks would return, and when they did, they would be ready. The Epsilon Dawn had changed, and so had the crew. They had become more than they had ever imagined, but there were dangers lurking in the shadows, ones they weren't prepared for yet. As the last Zkrak ship vanished into the darkness, Malik stood at the helm, his heart racing, his mind focused on the future. The Epsilon Dawn had become a legend, but legends were born in the fires of war, and Malik knew the worst was still to come. The Epsilon Dawn emerged victorious once again, but as the last of the Zkrak ships slipped into the void of space, the crew couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Malik stood in the command center, staring at the empty space on the screen. The Zkrak's fleet had been decimated, but there was no sense of triumph, no celebration, just an overwhelming sense of unease. The enemy was retreating, but they were not broken. Malik could feel it deep in his bones. They were preparing something bigger, something more devastating. Echo's voice once again filled the room. Captain, there is an anomaly within the data. The Zkrak's retreat does not align with their standard protocols. They are organizing a new fleet on a scale I have never seen before, and they are not acting alone. There are signatures of other forces in their fleet. Malik's pulse quickened. Other forces. The idea made his stomach churn. The Zkraks were powerful enough on their own, but the prospect of them forming an alliance with another race was terrifying. They could face the combined strength of two empires. He turned to his crew, who were now gathered in a tense silence. Everyone could feel the shift in the air. The Epsilon Dawn had brought them victory, but it hadn't made them invincible. They had no idea what they were up against, and the Zkraks were becoming more unpredictable with each passing day. Malik knew they needed to act quickly. They had no choice but to strike first again. But now, with an added level of uncertainty, they were not only fighting the Zkraks, they were now facing an unknown threat, and the stakes had just become even higher. The ship's sensors flared to life as the first sign of the new enemy forces appeared on the horizon. A massive fleet of ships, unlike anything the crew had seen before. They were sleek and alien, their design strikingly different from the Zkraks, but there was no mistaking their purpose. These were warships, and they were coming for the Epsilon Dawn, and the crew standing ready for the oncoming battle. Malik's hand clenched around the command console. The crew had grown stronger, but this new threat was something they hadn't prepared for. The question was, would they be able to stand their ground against an enemy they knew so little about? The Epsilon Dawn had been transformed from a forgotten relic into a force to be reckoned with, but now the crew was faced with a test of their own strength and resolve. They had already defied the odds, but this new threat was unlike anything they had encountered before. Malik could see it in their eyes, the fear and determination mixed together. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for the future of the galaxy, and they would have to be stronger than ever before. The Zkrak's fleet and their new allies approached at breakneck speed, but the Epsilon Dawn had evolved with each battle. It had learned how to adapt to every encounter, and this time it was ready. The ship's systems hummed with a new level of energy as it adjusted to the changing battle conditions. The crew worked as one, the chaos of the battlefield flowing through them like a single pulse, their every action guided by instinct and the power of the ship that had become an extension of themselves. Malik felt the connection between himself, the crew, and the ship deepening. It was no longer just technology, it was something more, something alive. As the battle began, the Epsilon Dawn danced through the oncoming fire, weaving between enemy ships with precision and grace. The crew's skill had reached new heights, and they pushed the ship to its limits. They were no longer just survivors. They were warriors. The universe would know their name. The battle raged on. The combined forces of the Zkraks and their unknown allies were relentless, their ships cutting through the void like a storm, and yet the Epsilon Dawn was holding its ground. It moved with deadly precision, its systems now fully synchronized with the crew. Every maneuver was a testament to their unity and the power of the ship. They had become more than just a team. They had become an unstoppable force. The enemy didn't know what to expect. They were faced with a ship that could adapt and evolve with every attack. Captain Malik stood at the helm, his mind sharp, his focus unwavering. The Epsilon Dawn responded to his every command with a fluidity that was almost uncanny. It was no longer just a ship, it was an extension of himself. The crew had learned how to work in harmony with the vessel, and it was becoming clear that they were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something much greater, something that would shape the future of the galaxy. The unknown enemy was fierce, their ships unlike anything the crew had encountered before, but Malik could see the cracks in their formation. Their ships lacked the coordination of the Z cracks, and that gave the crew an edge. They had to exploit it now. The battle was no longer just about firepower, it was about strategy and adaptability. The Epsilon Dawn could think faster than any enemy fleet. It could react before they even knew what was happening, and it was becoming a weapon of unmatched power in the hands of the crew. Echo's voice cut through the noise of the battle, providing real-time updates. Captain, the unknown ships are vulnerable in their rear sector. I recommend a targeted strike to destabilize their formation. The data has been cross-checked, and the odds of success are high. Malik nodded without hesitation. The plan was set, and the crew moved into action. The Epsilon Dawn shifted its course, moving with lethal grace into position. The Z-Cracks forces tried to anticipate their next move, but it was already too late. The crew had already anticipated their response, and the Epsilon Dawn was ready. The first wave of enemy ships crumpled under the Epsilon Dawn's firepower, their shields failing under the concentrated assault. The crew worked together with seamless efficiency. Malik felt the surge of power through the ship as it responded to their every need. They were no longer just humans in a ship. They had become a part of something greater, something ancient, something alive. The battle was theirs to win, and they were not going to back down. The unknown ships began to retreat, but the Z-Cracks were still holding strong. Their resolve was unwavering, but Malik could see the fear in their movements. They were losing control of the battlefield, and they knew it. The Epsilon Dawn had become the predator, and the Z-Cracks were its prey. Malik's heart raced as the final push began. The Epsilon Dawn surged forward, its weapons cutting down the remaining enemy ships. One by one, the Z-Cracks forces were scattered and in disarray. They could not match the power of the Epsilon Dawn any longer. The galaxy had witnessed the rise of something new, something powerful and unstoppable. As the last of the enemy ships vanished into the darkness of space, the crew stood in stunned silence. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Malik turned to his crew, his heart swelling with pride. They had done the impossible. They had changed the course of history. The Epsilon Dawn had gone from a forgotten relic to a weapon of legend, and together they had forged a new future for the galaxy. But even as they celebrated their victory, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The galaxy was vast and unknown, and there were forces out there that still had not revealed themselves. Yet the Epsilon Dawn was ready for whatever came next, and so were they. The crew had become something more than they had ever imagined. They were no longer just survivors. They were the vanguard of a new age.